It's the oldest continuous museum display in the world. I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today I'm taking you on a tour through England's oldest museum and one of the oldest museums in the world, the White Tower at the Tower of London, the most famous castle keep in the world, built at the tail end of the 11th century by William the Conqueror to subdue and overawe Londoners, not to mention deter foreign and domestic invaders. It's a former royal residence and home to England's oldest museum, part of the Royal Armouries collection displayed in the Line of Kings, open to the public since the late 17th century. Today we'll be exploring the entire White Tower and seeing its most interesting, weird, and wonderful museum objects. We've got Henry VIII's armour, his daughter Elizabeth's wooden face and missing body, a Tiffany gun, an executioner's axe, a pristine 11th century chapel, a tale of a prisoner escaping with a rope and a wine bottle, and so much more. A few weeks ago, I just released a video about the oddities of the Tower of London, so this is kind of a part 2.
Well, my next video, coming up in 2 weeks, is all about torture and execution at the tower. However, today we are going to see a few torture instruments, talk about people executed here, and visit the dungeon.
There are 4 levels to the White Tower. 3 you can see very clearly. The top floor is where kings of England would have lived when they're resident here at the Tower of London. It's also where Henry VIII's mother, Elizabeth of York, the boy's sister, died in childbirth. The floor below that is where the king would have had a council chamber, a banqueting hall. On the far side is the Chapel Royal of St John the Evangelist, and it was in that chapel that the Order of the Bath was first established, one of England's highest orders for chivalry.
Let's jump right into the entrance of the White Tower. Here we can see a little reference to the 2 princes in the tower. Now, I've spoken about them before on my channel. See, they were the sons of Edward IV, and the eldest was to be King Edward V. They were held in what was then known as the Garden Tower, which is now called the Bloody Tower. They were placed there in 1483 by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would later become King Richard III. He supposedly wanted to keep them safe before young Edward's coronation. However, they were never seen or heard from again, and it's believed that Richard III ordered for them to be murdered so that he could seize the crown. In 1674, workmen at the Tower of London discovered a wooden box containing 2 small human skeletons.
Skeletons of the 2 princes were discovered right near this spot in the White Tower.
King Charles II had these bones buried in Westminster Abbey, where they remain. Many believe that these bones are likely those of the young princes, but of course, we simply don't know. Other bones have been suggested to be theirs as well, buried at Windsor. I would love for King Charles III to allow for some DNA testing.
We've entered into the actual structure itself, and just remember, this was a royal residence, so the walls would have been hung with rich tapestries. There would have been very beautiful furniture here. It would have looked like the recreation of the medieval palace that you saw in my last video about the tower. You can also see some images of illustrious visitors who've come here throughout the Line of Kings history. Samuel Pepys, the diarist who came in the 1660s, Jovan de Rochefort, who came in 1672, he was a French map maker, Francis, Duke of Lorraine with a very fancy hat, 1731, Phyllis Wheatley, an African-American slave and poet who came here in 1773, William Hutton, a bookseller from Birmingham, 1785, Ibrahim Pasha, a visitor in 1846, the Viceroy of Egypt, and finally Empress Eugenie, a visitor in 1860. I'd say that means we're in pretty good company. And remember, this is the oldest museum attraction in England and one of the oldest in the world, so a lot of very famous people have come through these doors before us. On the wall, a historic illustration of the tower's armories display, and here, a very early stereo photograph by John David Burton from 1868. Obviously there are big differences, but it's essentially the same museum today as it has been historically. For centuries, tourists have been able to come and look at this mix of fakes and real historic treasures, featuring kings of England sometimes wearing their actual armour atop carved wooden horses, and even carrying swords. Now, a few have always been missing. We won't find Richard III here. I wonder why. There's a few other notable absences, but I'm going to come to that a bit later on. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm delighted to have you here, and I hope that you choose to stick around, like, comment, subscribe, and all that stuff. If you're a regular viewer, I really think that you'll enjoy my Patreon channel. Over there, I've just released a separate video all about the tower's legendary church, St. Peter ad Vincula. Also over on my Patreon channel, you'll find an interview that I recently did with Margot Moore, a fellow tour guide and YouTuber over on Crown and Kingdom. She used to live here at the Tower of London, and she tells me all about her experiences. That's available for all my Patreon members, even at the free level. Just click the link below. On Patreon, I release at least one extra video tour every month, and you'll also get access to my extensive archive with more than 24 exclusive videos and bonus content. Plus, an invitation to my annual in-person free Patreon-only tours. I hope to see you over on Patreon. There's been a sort of horse armory at the tower featuring wooden horses and armoured kings since the 1540s. For instance, in 1652, a Dutch diplomat called Lodewijk Huygens wrote that he had been to see, quote, wooden horses with armed men on them, and he was very impressed. However, this line of kings as we know it today was first initiated by the Board of Ordnance in the late 17th century to promote the Stuart monarchy. This was, of course, following the tumult, not to mention the execution of the king in the decades previous. So this was a little like razzle-dazzle PR move. You might notice that many kings are no longer on their proud timber steeds. They did a massive restoration on all of these horses back in the early 2010s, and project leader Karen Whitting revealed that they checked the condition of their horses, quote, by shining a light up their bottoms. That's why this says these are endoscopies. When they inspected a lot of the horses, they found that some of them were so fragile that they wouldn't be able to carry mannequins or statues at all anymore. So Henry VIII and Charles II are on foot. Now, where's William the Conqueror? Well, he was taken out of the line of kings in the 1820s, along with Edward III, John of Gaunt, and Henry V. A distinguished tower historian called Samuel Mayrick made it his mission to make the line of kings more accurate. He was disgusted by the entire display. William was in armor that was from more than 5 centuries after his death, and he was carrying a 17th century musket. That meant that though the display was more historically accurate, it lost a lot of its showmanship, and there was very little left to represent the medieval period. So the White Tower bought a load of genuine antiques and beautiful fakes to bulk things out a bit. Some of these objects are a bit disparate. Like this little wooden figure in armor, who might actually be part of an ancient automaton clock. He really has nothing to do with the line of kings, but they share a common heritage, that everything on display in these galleries has been a part of the line of kings display at some point. Let's start having a look at some of the different royal kings and princes and their armor, as well as some true oddities. Here is some armor from early in Henry VIII's life. He was in his late teens here. Look at how his armor almost looks like he's wearing a long skirt, a knee-length skirt. Well, yes, this is because, of course, Henry VIII had just married Catherine of Aragon. Look here on the bottom of the armor. You can see a beautiful H's and K's entwined with vines. That's, of course, representing Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. They were just married. On his boot, you can see some beautiful decorations. Look here at the pomegranate. This was Catherine of Aragon's symbol given to her when she married Henry VIII. It's meant to represent fertility and fecundity. That's because the pomegranate has many seeds. Of course, that didn't work out too well for Catherine of Aragon, who only had one living child, a daughter. Right below that pomegranate, you can see the beautiful stylized Tudor rose. There's a number of them all over this panel and all over the armor itself, repeated again and again to symbolize a long and happy marriage, which of course is not what happened. Now let's have a look at another piece of armor from Henry VIII from 31 years later, completed around 1540. Look at all of the different pieces, the cuisse, the gauntlets. Henry VIII was nearly 50 by this time, and towards the end of his life, he weighed between 350 and 400 pounds. That's between 160 and 180 kilos. He also had a suppurating wound that would not heal. No expense was spared, even though it was unlikely he ever wore this for jousting or atop a horse. By this point in his life, he was pretty ill with gout, and he also had a suppurating wound on his leg that doctors wouldn't allow to heal, owing to the medical thought of the day. Instead, this armour is all about projecting power. Now, a different set of armour of Henry's was actually chosen for his horse at the Line of Kings. This is the armour that sat atop the carved figure. It's got a very prominent downstairs. And let me show you the horse that he used to sit atop. Remember, the horses were no longer in good enough condition to have the armour sitting on top of them. This horse here, not the one wearing the interesting German paytrol or bridle, but this plain one, this was the one Henry VIII was atop. Just look at how cool these horses are. They're so amazing. This little suit of armour was made for Prince Henry, son of James I. The prince's early death meant that the crown went to his brother, the sickly Charles I, and we all know what happened there. Sweetly, we actually have a portrait of the prince wearing it. He's about 13 here. For a long time, this armour used to be on display with a sign saying that it was from one of the two princes in the tower, but we now know that it was for Prince Henry. And just look at the elaborate designs all over it. Now, speaking of Charles I, look at this gilded armour. The decorations are meant to evoke a medieval saint. Charles probably wore this at the Battle of Naseby. Absolutely beautiful. May not have the large downstairs property that Henry VIII did, but I think this is probably the most remarkable armour in the collection. Here's another suit of armour for a child. It's been assigned to both Charles I and Charles II when they were boys, so it's kind of a family heirloom. Now, it was after the death of Charles II that one of the finest wood carvers in the world at the time was commissioned to create a wooden statue and horse to place on display here in the Line of Kings. Grinling Gibbons was paid £40 in 1685 for the carving of Charles II just a few months after his death. This was 8 times what was paid to the carvers of the previous Line of Kings figures. By the way, he also did the carvings on the organ at St. Peter ad Vincula. Now, Meyrick may have removed the armour of William the Conqueror and taken it off display, but it was later put back on display and attributed to Henry Lee. He's in my National Portrait Gallery video, part 2. He was the master of the armoury in the 1580s. Lee is of the correct time period to have owned this armour, but the real answer is that we don't know for sure. This was the one that used to be on display for William the Conqueror, though. I have a solution to all of this. I travel a lot, and right now I'm in the Canadian wilderness. I know it's a big shift away from the Tower of London, but traveling with a toddler and limited luggage space is always tough. Not to mention, extra luggage fees are a fortune. Using these airless vacuum compression bags has saved my sanity. This is the same amount of clothes. Just look at this. I've used vacuum sealed bags before, but nothing like these. This little USB rechargeable air pump makes it so easy to use. And the quality of the construction is also really impressive. This is strong anti-rip nylon, and they have anti-leak zippers and really strong zipper pulls. Seriously, I convinced my mom to buy these even before I had this discount code. Airless bags are already on sale, and you get an extra 10% off when you use my discount code MUSEUMGUIDE. Just click the link below and order them now. We have this big wall of cuirasses. These are just munition armor preserved in the tower, and they've been used as mass wall decoration from at least the middle of the 17th century. I really thought that this was more modern curation, but it's amazing to find out that pieces of armor have been used as decoration in this way for hundreds of years. Now, these are some of the most beloved bits of armor in the White Tower. They're referred to as the dwarf and the giant. Now we think that the little suit was either made for court dwarf Geoffrey Hudson, yes, having a court dwarf was a thing, or maybe even for King Charles I when he was around 5 years old, probably around the time that that other suit that we saw was made for his brother Henry. Just look at the dragon atop the helmet. Anybody would love this, whether they were a fully grown adult or a little kid. By the way, Geoffrey Hudson was very close to Queen Henrietta Marie, was also her close confidant. Now the larger one, that's certainly for a very large man. It's German field armour, and it was made to fit a man for about 6'8", that's 203 centimeters. It dates from around the same time as the small armour, the early 17th century. The lore used to be that this was medieval armour of John of Gaunt, but now we think that it was a diplomatic gift from the Dukes of Brunswick. You can see there in the curation that they talk about how the line of kings was never meant to just showcase the line of monarchs. It's always been about having a series of oddities, nobles, and unusual bits and pieces. Museums are always filled with curiosities, and this has never been any different. Just as much for entertainment as for education. How I love this horse. My goodness. Now here we have a figure of James II. He was originally denied a place in the line of kings, and he was only added in 1827. He has his luxurious shoulder-length wig, and I think that might even be his original wooden face on horseback, you know? Now James II was positioned in a very specific way in the line of kings. He was standing as if leaving the line, reflecting his abdication in 1688. But that was also just good curation because it left a space to allow visitors to walk by. Now, as I mentioned, weird bits and pieces have been added throughout the centuries, but there's always been strange stuff. A Tower inventory of 1527 recorded this: a steel collar for a prisoner. You can see the 16th century spelling. A Spanish collar for torture taken in 1588. Now, even though it is likely Spanish, early Tower guidebooks liked to claim that this was a collar for a scold. Of course they did. Now here is really one of my favorite displays at the entire Tower of London. These are the wooden heads that used to be atop a lot of the different figures of the kings in the line of kings. They have such a folk art appeal to me. I love them. They really remind me of the wooden effigies at Westminster Abbey. They are just some of the faces from the mannequins used throughout history for the line of kings. Now, most of these date to the late 17th century revamp of the line of kings. Remember, that's when it was all about creating Stuart propaganda, and that's the date of most of the horses as well. I think they are all the more meaningful for their kind of scuffs and cracks and scars caused by years of wearing heavy helmets and armor. I absolutely love the hands as well. I couldn't really find any information about who the hands belong to, but I will tell you about the heads. This is likely William III, also known as William of Orange. His head dates to 1702. We can see his very bold Roman nose and sunken cheeks. This was carved by Nicholas Alcock, a colleague of Grinling Gibbons. Speaking of Gibbons, sadly, his 1686 carving of Charles II is stripped down to the bare wood. He's the one at the top in the center. Next to him, to the right, this more fleshy face is likely Henry V. And this other bare face might be Henry VI or VII. No one is really sure. We can be sure of the next Henry, though. I mean, there's no mistaking that mug now, is there? This is Henry VIII. The finest head in the collection is often regarded to be this one here, of Edward III. It was carved from a single block and uses realistic natural colors. It was likely made by John Nost in the 1680s. I got a beautiful crouching Venus by him at the V&A. He charged half of what Gibbons did, £20, for the figure and the horse. But I would argue that for half the price, it's really of similar quality, so I would call this a good bargain. Now, this one here, who I really think looks like Paul McCartney, was the one that used to be displayed as William the Conqueror, by the way, and it has the name James carved into the back, so who knows. But it's kind of cool. If I angle the camera like this, you can see the head and the armor that used to represent William the Conqueror. It's likely that neither of them are William the Conqueror. Here is the beautiful Charles I face, also carved by Grinling Gibbons after the death of Charles II. Charles I and Charles II were added to the line of kings. And here, this is likely James I. No one knows whether this was a stylistic choice or if he's designed to depict a Moorish or African man. The curation here says that he's a black man-at-arms. It's this horse here in the middle at the back. That's the one carved by Gibbons for Charles I in 1689. Check out this armour on this horse. It's kind of giving me a bra vibe here. I love the little faces on it as well. The horse itself formerly carried the Greenwich armour of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. The horse's armour is embossed with grotesque hooded heads. It was probably purchased for the horse display in the 19th century. So cool. I really did my best to find the horse that's specifically attributed to Grinling Gibbons of Charles II, and I couldn't. So that's maybe a topic for a future video. This seems like kind of a little guy here. This is Maximilian armour. It's complete field armour, displayed on either side of the armour of Henry VII. They were probably for pages. So we've now seen a lot of the line of kings, but did you notice an absence? I certainly did. This sign here addresses it. A line of queens. Many royal figures have featured in the line of kings, but queens have always been absent. But Queen Elizabeth almost was here. It was proposed in 1789, and a wooden model and horse was actually made. We can see her head here upstairs. However, she went on display at a different part of the White Tower. She, her wooden horse, and her page were all relocated to Lancaster House in 1916 for the new London Museum, which opened in 1924, and this head actually still belongs to them. A former Tower historian and author, Geoffrey Parnell, quote, believes her horse and her little page may lie in a pit under a car park a stone's throw from the Ritz, buried for protection in the First World War. Where'd your body go, Liz?
Now that we've seen a bit of the collection, let's talk about the general history of the White Tower before we head upstairs again. This building is one of the most, if not the most, complete 11th century palaces in Europe. It was constructed as both a military fort and a place for the king and his family to live. King William I, aka William the Conqueror, in the late 11th century. With all of this talk of William the Conqueror and the Bayeux Tapestry at the British Museum, this is a very timely topic. The White Tower is the oldest part of the tower complex. The fortifications and all of the walls around the tower that we know today were constructed under Henry III in the 13th century. We cover some of that information in my Tower Oddities video. Henry III was the first king to whitewash the tower, by the way. That's where the name comes from. Since then, this imposing stone fortress has been home to the Crown Jewels, a notorious prison, a place of torture and execution, the Royal Observatory, and the Royal Mint. Its name is shorthand for a place of security, and yes, it is still technically a royal palace.
Here we can see a Norman garderobe. What's that, you might ask? A garderobe was a medieval toilet, which conveniently emptied right onto the ground below. Now, historically, this would have smelled really, really terrible, of course. It's a medieval toilet, but people actually believed that the ammonia smell would protect their clothing and objects from pests, so they would actually store their clothes in here. Oh my goodness, 2 garderobes. You know it's a fancy place when there's multiple toilets. Wow, just look at this unbelievable Norman fireplace. This is one of the earliest known wall fireplaces in England, and it was one of 4 in the White Tower. But this should really help you envision what this place was like when it was a grand royal residence.
More than anywhere else in the Tower of London, stepping into this Norman church, St. John's Chapel, really makes me feel like I'm stepping back in time. By the way, in this context, Norman means the era of English history initiated by the Norman conquest of William the Conqueror from 1066 to 1154. In contrast to St. Peter ad Vincula, which I covered in my recent Patreon-only video, that chapel was meant for public worship, but this chapel was meant to be used for personal worship. And, of course, sometimes other smaller chapels were used, including the one where Henry VI was murdered, and that was down to preference and royals living in other residences on site. We're going to speak about the Peasants' Revolt in my upcoming video about torture, murder, and execution at the Tower. And this chapel is where Richard II and the future Henry IV hid during that event. Sadly, it's also where Henry VII's wife, Elizabeth of York, laid in state after her death in childbirth in 1503, and it was here that her granddaughter Mary I wed Philip of Spain, in what would ultimately be an unhappy and unfruitful marriage. Here in this chapel, you can really see the Caen stone that the Tower of London is made from. I went to Caen last year and visited William the Conqueror's final resting place. One day I'll make a video about the resting place of every English monarch.
So now the second most, I think, famous part of the White Tower's museum section is the treasures of the Tower armories. Just look at these, the lion and unicorn supporters, carved and gilded wooden figures, originally on either side of a shield bearing the royal arms. I love these guys. And then this absolutely massive book, the Ledger of Receipts, Returns and Issues, discovered in store in 1914. It's 914 pages long, and it only covers the period between 21st June 1675 and the 2nd of September 1679. And the mail sleeve. I mean, we've seen the really fancy armor for the kings and noblemen downstairs, but this was the kind of armor a mail coat sleeve and an iron hat would be used for regular soldiers. However, this hat is a little bit different. This one was found during excavation near London Bridge, and it's actually been used as a cooking pot at different points in its history. It's wild. Staff weapons. More armor of King Henry VIII. He had a lot. This here in the center, this is a brigantine that may have belonged to Henry VIII as well. Originally covered with cloth of gold, decorated with scalloped edges and punched flowers. This is essentially padded cloth armor. It's a lot less expensive than using metal for everything. And just look at this horse bit, also probably from the armory of Henry VIII. The massive long wooden spear behind is a parade lance. It's probably been preserved because it's unusually huge. It dates to the late 16th century. This armor belonged to the Earl of Worcester. Wow! Combining the latest technical advances, especially hardened steel. When this was fully assembled as siege armor, it weighs 59 kilos. That's 130 pounds. And that makes it the heaviest armor in the world. Look at this unbelievable saddle. It's wooden, and it's thought to have been a gift from Sigismund, the King of Hungary, to Henry V in 1416. That was to commemorate his membership of the Hungarian Order of the Dragon. They were created to, quote, fight the enemies of Christendom, especially the Ottoman Turks. But wow, I don't think I've ever even heard of a wooden saddle before. A little display showing you a line of king's swords from George I through some of the Edwards and a William, all the way to King George VI. The armories hold diplomatic gifts as well. This is a samurai suit that was given from Tokugawa Hidetada of Japan. He presented it to James I in 1613. It was a gift to celebrate the first ever trade agreement between Britain and Japan. Just look at that. This is a horse armor tailpiece. It's a dragon's head, and it sits above the horse's tail, allowing the horse's tail to come flowing through its mouth. It's really cool. It came to Woolwich Arsenal as a trophy from Paris in 1815. Just like downstairs in the line of kings, the 19th century curators and collectors, they made it their mission to fill in gaps in the collection. And so this was something purchased in the 19th century. It's a beautiful shield depicting the death of Charles the Bold at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. Wow, it's incredible. Similarly too, this burgonet, purchased in 1825. The ordnance storekeepers wanted to broaden the scope of the armories, and so this dates to around 1600, but it was purchased in 1826. There's Samuel Myrick there. We spoke about him downstairs. He was the one who wrote a 3-volume work on the history of arms and armour called A Critical Inquiry into Ancient Armour. He wrote to the Duke of Wellington in 1821, incensed at the inaccuracies in the collection. And it's really thanks to him that things were made more accurate. I love this close helmet. These were popular in the 15th and 16th centuries, enclosing the head with a visor and bever. These shields here are called bucklers. They're made of wood and gesso, and they often depict historic scenes, many famous Roman battles, for instance. The one on the top depicts the Roman attack led by Camillus of the Gauls. You can see these great pointed cuirasses here. This one's from Brantspeth Castle, and it came from the Cripps Day collection. Again, you can see that the curators here have chosen to highlight different collectors of arms throughout history who have bequeathed or presented objects to the Armoury's collection. And I should be clear, this is only a small portion of what the Royal Armouries has in their collection. The main Royal Armouries Museum is in Leeds. Let me know if you'd be interested in having me visit there. There's some very unusual pieces of armour that I'd love to go and have a look at, including this helmet of Henry VIII. I can't wait to see that in person one day. That horse's muzzle is absolutely beautiful. And again, a lot more helmets and gauntlets and shields and pieces of armour. I'm no armour expert, but I did talk about it a little bit in my video about the Wallace collection. If you are an armour enthusiast, other than the Royal Armouries I just mentioned, you need to come, of course, here to the White Tower, but also to the Wallace collection. This display case is called Arms as Art. I'm not really sure how I feel about that, but I will say I am very fascinated by this one here. This is called the Tiffany Revolver. North American gunmaker Smith & Wesson donated this revolver to the Royal Armouries in 1989, and the New York jeweler Tiffany & Co. was commissioned to decorate it as part of the museum's policy to commission and collect examples of fine craftsmanship. I mean, if I was going to own a gun, I would like it to be that one. Here's a whole display case of treasures from the Thames. Things connected to or representing the Tower of London that have been fished out of the river. And of course, if you watch my channel regularly, you know that that is mudlarking. I talk about mudlarking a lot, including in this video dedicated to the Museum of London's exhibition just on that topic. They've got this listed number 3 as a rondelle dagger. I don't know, to me it looks like a bollocks dagger, kind of. Bollocks daggers are what they sound like. They were daggers decorated to look like male genitalia, and they'd be worn prominently outside the clothes. I'm not sure if that's actually what this is. 1,000-year-old stirrup. Just look at this, a little toy matchlock pistol. They're found at archaeological sites all across England. And trust me, as the mum to a toddler, I know little bits and pieces of toys get lost all the time. And here, right on the end, a child's sword used for teaching young boys how to properly carry and fight with the sword that they would later wear even with their civilian dress. It was found with coins from the reign of Edward IV, so we think it comes from around 1475. This horse here was the inspiration for the line of kings downstairs. It's about 100 years older. It's the oldest known English equestrian statue on a long-term loan from the Lumley family to the Royal Armouries. This was commissioned to decorate John Lord Lumley's family home, Lumley Castle, in County Durham. He may have been inspired by similar statues he saw in Florence in 1566. And so we had this one commissioned and made to represent King Edward III. Edward III was king when Lumley Castle was built in the middle of the 14th century. This painting here depicts the arrest of Anne Boleyn in 1536, but it was painted more than 300 years later in 1872 by David Wilkie Winfield. We've come up one more flight of stairs, and now we're on the top of the White Tower.
This is Keeper. He's a sculpture made out of arms and armour, and as we'll find out soon on this floor, he is part of a long tradition of making sculptures and creatures out of leftover bits of armour to amaze visitors to the tower.
Here in the top floor of the tower's displays, it's all about the Board of Ordnance and a bunch of other bits and pieces. But the Board of Ordnance essentially, for more than 400 years, was responsible for procuring weapons and munitions. There's a few little displays on this floor that kind of overlap with some of the displays that we saw in more detail in my last video about the tower's oddities. Here's a little display about the menagerie, a little display about the royal mint, and this little display of torture devices. Here's the armour that was worn during the coronation of George IV in 1821 by Henry Dimmock, the King's Champion. The champion's role is to ride into the coronation banquet and fight anyone who denies the new monarch's right to the throne. Literally throw down a gauntlet, and no one has ever actually challenged the King's Champion to a fight. But the coronation of Charles III that just happened a few years ago, yes, a King's Champion was still there. The earliest King's Champion is all the way back in 1377, and it's still a tradition that continues today. Here you have some uniforms from the Board of Ordnance and some weapons and other things. Now, this display I find particularly interesting. This shows a building called the Grand Storehouse that was built between 1688 and 1692. It was the largest building at the tower at 110 meters long. That's 360 feet. Lots of objects from the Board of Ordnance and the Royal Armouries were there, but there was a catastrophe. It was destroyed by a great fire in 1841. These are so neat. These are trophies in the form of a bird and an arm and an axe, and they're made from the parts of obsolete weapons. The bird includes pistol belt hooks for its wings, and its beak might even be a bayonet tip. The arm and the axe use the top jaws from the cocks of flintlock weapons and a late 19th century boarding axe. Trophies like this used to be a very popular display at the White Tower, and there used to be a lot of them until a curator in the early 20th century got rid of them. Now, remember I told you that the Grand Storehouse, it burnt down in 1841. These are the Grand Storehouse keys that survived. And over on the other side here, look at this candlestick made from a fire relic. Pieces of wood and metal debris were actually sold as souvenirs and sometimes used to create new art objects, like this one. This is made of gun locks, musket ramrods, bayonet blades, and twisted metal. And here you can see a fretwork illustration of that great fire. This bronze triple gun, it's French, probably from around 1705. Like a lot of the other bronze weapons displayed there, it was badly damaged by the Great Fire. I mentioned a scold's collar a little bit earlier on, but in the center there, that's a scold's bridle, traditionally used to punish gossips, known as scolds. They also had serrated iron tongues to make it painful to speak. This is a German design, and it was actually fitted with a bell so that you could tell if a woman was speaking when she wasn't supposed to be. It was probably never actually used in England. It was probably purchased just as an oddity for the tower. Same thing here. This particularly gruesome looking one really looks like something out of a horror movie. This was told to Victorian visitors to the tower that it was an executioner's mask, but it's probably just a repurposed scold's bridle though.
Ranulph Flambard was a medieval Norman Bishop of Durham and an influential government official of King William Rufus of England. He was the son of a priest of Bayeux in Normandy, and Flambard was actually a nickname that meant incendiary. This could have referred to his actions in the church as a torchbearer, or maybe to his personality. He also worked on construction projects, supervising the first stone bridge in London and overseeing the construction of the King's Hall at Westminster. When King Rufus died in 1100, his successor, Henry I, imprisoned Ranulph in the Tower. Ranulph was a good scapegoat for all of the financial tomfoolery of the previous king, and what's amazing is that, while he was the Tower's first prisoner, he was also its first escapee. In 1101, he climbed through one of the White Tower's windows using a rope that had been smuggled into him in a gallon of wine. Genius. The final prisoner in the Tower had a similarly dramatic tale. He was a German spy named Joseph Jacobs, and he was executed by firing squad. He parachuted into the UK during World War II and was captured shortly thereafter. He was then convicted of espionage under the Treachery Act of 1940. Since he was captured as an enemy combatant, he was shot by military firing squad instead of being hanged. This was the very chair he was seated on when a bolt-action rifle was used to execute him.
Around the northeast corner, that tower is much larger, circular tower, and it was on the top of that tower where the Royal Observatory was first established here at the Tower of London. It was only here for a short while, a few years before it moved to Greenwich. That tower's haunted by the ghost of Maud. Maud caught the eye of King John, Richard Lionheart's brother, and apparently she was a bit of an old maid, I think she was about 20. And apparently King John, upset by her rebuffals, murdered her with a poisoned egg.
Did you know that this was the first location of the Royal Observatory, which I explore in depth in its own video? It's true. Before the Royal Observatory was built in Greenwich, astronomer Royal John Flamsteed did the first observations here in the northeast turret, starting in 1675. He actually complained that the ravens were getting in his way, and that's one of the reasons that King Charles II built him a proper facility in Greenwich Park that year.
We're now in the storehouse, the final section that we'll visit in the Tower of London. These frames were once filled with grenades and a mixture of pitch, tallow, saltpeter, and gunpowder.
Now, you know I love this. This little section is labeled Tower Curiosities. Now, I argue that a lot of what we have seen in the White Tower have been curiosities, but this is what they have set aside. This bell is inscribed in Burmese and Pali, recording that it was cast by the order of the King and Queen of Prom, now PA, in Myanmar, for a monastery. It was then captured and looted by Field Marshal Sir William Gom, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in India, and presented to the Tower when he was its constable in 1874. This strongbox is from Havana. It was taken by the British when they seized Havana from the Spanish in 1762. The keyhole here is a decoy. The real one is actually inside. Then we can see this 17th century German banner. It bears the names of Baron Ferdinand von Hompesch, the last Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. Now this is my favorite. It's a winged lion with a halo, one of the traditional depictions of St. Mark the Evangelist, captured in 1809 when British forces besieged Corfu, then under Napoleonic rule. What a majestically goofy lion. These cast iron door hinges were from a Netherlandish gunpowder store. The British invaded the Netherlands to curb Napoleon's expansion, though obviously this was unsuccessful. But they did get these iron hinges. And wow, these two shell cases are from the incendiary bombs dropped when the Zeppelin airship attacked London. Charles Foulkes, the curator of the armories at the time, gathered them after the attack, even though this was actually quite foolish and he'd been told not to. He earned a mild reprimand, but was allowed to keep these souvenirs because of their historic significance.
And this one here, the bronze culverin, recovered by divers in 1840 from the wreck of the Mary Rose, which sank off of Portsmouth in 1545. It says, Henry VIII, King of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, most unconquered. Maybe unconquered, but not unsinkable. And then look at this amazing bronze cannon Perrier, cast in the Portuguese colony of Macau in China. It's absolutely beautiful, in the shape of a lion. Can you see that with the paws and the face? And the tail on the bum here. The legs on the side. Now remember, the very bottom of the Tower of London was used as a prison and even kind of a dungeon. And it's here that some prisoners would be held. They've got a very tiny display about execution here, talking about Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was one of Queen Elizabeth I's favorites, and he was the last person to be beheaded inside the Tower walls. Found guilty of treason, a scaffold was built on the parade ground just outside this building. It took 3 blows to take his head off. This is an executioner's axe from the 16th century, but it's not likely the one that actually executed Devereux, nor is this the execution block. This one is oak, and it's thought to have been prepared for the execution of Simon Fraser, the Lord Lovat, which was on Tower Hill in 1647. Look at the deep cuts at the top of the block. Here is an executioner's sword. We know Anne Boleyn was not executed with an axe, but instead with a sword, considered more merciful than the axe. And here we can see parts of the original late 11th century foundations through this little window that they've kindly put in the floor. Here, this is likely where Charles, Duke of Orleans, was imprisoned while in the Tower of London. In 1597, the Jesuit priest John Gerard wrote, "The chamber was underground and dark, particularly near the entrance. It was a vast place and every instrument of torture was there."
But we will certainly talk more about these grim topics in our next video, out in 2 weeks' time, all about torture and execution at the Tower of London.
And on that note, that brings us to the end of the displays at the White Tower. I hope that you've enjoyed exploring this museum as much as I've enjoyed showing it to you, and I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.